Snow drifted silently across the wire. It was December 1945, the first Christmas the German women would spend as prisoners on American soil. The camp lay quiet beneath a pale moon, the barracks lined in frost, the air sharp with the smell of wood smoke. Inside, the women huddled on their bunks, blankets drawn tight, each lost in thoughts of home. For many, the date cut like a blade. Back in Germany, Christmas had been sacred even in the darkest years. Bombs had fallen, rations had shrunk, churches had collapsed into rubble, but still, candles were lit, carols whispered, prayers murmured in cellars. Now, far from family, hemmed in by barbed wire, even those small comforts seemed stolen. Anna sat on her bunk, rubbing her hands together for warmth. She remembered Christmas of 1944, a single candle stub lit in a basement, her mother humming Stille Nacht under her breath while snow filtered through broken beams above. There had been no bread, no gifts, only silence pierced by the distant drone of bombers. Yet it had still been Christmas. Tonight, in captivity, she felt nothing but emptiness. Around her, whispers flickered like embers. "Do you think they'll allow us a service?" "Why would they? We are prisoners. At home my children will sing without me. They will hang stockings on rubble." Tears shone in tired eyes. A few women clasped hands, murmuring prayers. Most sat in silence, shame and sorrow choking their throats. Then, just before dusk, boots crunched in the snow outside. A guard shouted, his voice carrying into the barracks, "All prisoners prepare! You are being escorted into town. Tonight, church service." The women froze. Church? Surely they had misheard. They looked at one another in disbelief. A church service? For them, the enemy? Suspicion rippled through the room. Some muttered darkly that it must be a trick, a humiliation staged for American amuse. Meant. Others whispered prayers of gratitude. When the gates clanged open, they marched in lines through the snow. Guards flanked them, rifles slung lazily across shoulders, their breath steaming in the cold. The prisoners walked with heads lowered, hearts pounding. They expected jeers, perhaps stones from civilians. Christmas, after all, might bring out hatred rather than mercy. But as they entered the small American town, what they found was something else entirely. The streets glowed with lanterns and strings of lights, a brightness they had not seen in years. Windows flickered with candles. Evergreen garlands draped doors. In the air floated the mingled scents of pine, roasted meat, and fresh bread. The women inhaled sharply, stunned. In Germany, cities lay dark under blackout curtains, their churches gutted, their homes in ruins. Here, lights shone boldly, defiantly, as though the war had never reached across the ocean. Children in scarves darted past, laughing, their arms heavy with parcels. A shop window displayed cakes and toys. Music spilled faintly from a nearby house, the rise and fall of a hymn sung in harmony. The prisoners walked in silence, their breaths ragged, their eyes darting from house to house. Some bit their lips to keep from crying. Others whispered to one another, "This cannot be real. It is too much." At last they reached the church. Its spire rose above the town, bells ringing softly in the cold night. Snow blanketed its roof, candles glowed in every window. People gathered at the door, wrapped in coats, their faces warm in the light. The women hesitated at the steps, their boots crunched on the snow, their eyes wide with unease. They had expected humiliation, but the townsfolk only watched quietly, their expressions unreadable. Some nodded faintly, not with malice, but with a curious blend of pity and welcome. The guards gestured forward. The women shuffled up the steps, through the doors, and gasped. Inside, the church glowed with warmth. Candles flickered along the walls, wreaths of evergreen and holly draped the rafters, garlands twined around the altar. The scent of pine and wax hung heavy, mingled with the faint sweetness of apples laid in baskets near the front. Wooden pews gleamed in lamplight. A choir hummed softly as people settled into seats. The German women froze in the doorway. For many it was like stepping back into memory, the memory of Christmases long before war had stripped joy from their lives. Some raised trembling hands to their mouths, eyes brimming with tears. Others clutched each other's sleeves, whispering in disbelief. And then the music began. The organ's first notes swelled, deep and resonant. The choir lifted their voices in a hymn every woman in the doorway knew by heart. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Gasps broke from the prisoners. The words were in German, sung gently, reverently, by American voices. Anna's knees buckled. She gripped the pew before her, sobs catching in her chest. Beside her, Marta pressed both hands to her face, tears streaming freely. Whispers trembled from lips. "They sing for us!" They remembered our tongue. The guards shifted uneasily, uncertain what to do. But the townsfolk only continued to sing, their voices rich, filling the sanctuary with peace. For the prisoners it was unbearable. For the first time since capture, they felt not chains, not hatred, but mercy, and that mercy cut deeper than any cruelty could have. One woman whispered hoarsely, "It feels like home before the war." Another murmured through tears, "We thought we would never hear it again." The hymn rose higher, candles flickering, shadows dancing across faces both captive and free. And in that moment, the German women realized they were no longer enemies in a war. They were simply human beings, gathered under one roof on Christmas Eve, bound together by song. And yet, as tears fell and voices broke, the question lingered in every heart. Why? Why would the enemy offer such mercy? The answer was not yet clear, but the shock of that night would remain with them long after the final candle guttered. The organ's chords lingered in the air as the congregation's voices softened into silence. The German women stood awkwardly in the back, their breath still trembling from the shock of hearing Stille Nacht sung in their own language. The townspeople shifted to make room in the pews. A guard nudged the women forward, murmuring, "Sit, it's all right." Hesitantly they filed into rows. The wood was warm under their hands, polished smooth by decades of worshippers. A few of the townsfolk glanced their way, not with scorn, but with pity. Some even nodded faintly, acknowledging their presence as though to say, "Tonight, even enemies may kneel together." Anna sat rigid, her eyes darting between the altar and the choir. She could not shake the memory of her mother singing the same hymn last Christmas, in a cellar in Leipzig, her voice cracking as bombs thundered above. Tears pricked her eyes. She bowed her head, hiding them in the shadows. The service continued. Candles flickered. The minister spoke of peace, of the birth of Christ as hope in dark times. His words, though in English, carried weight the women could still grasp. He spoke slowly, solemnly, his voice resonating against the stone walls. "Tonight we remember mercy. Tonight we remember that even in war, God does not abandon his children." The women exchanged glances. They were not accustomed to being called children of God by their captors. For months they had been treated as enemies, as shadows of a defeated nation. Now, in this warm glow, their humanity was being quietly restored. Then came the music again. This time the choir began with an English carol, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," voices gentle and clear. The prisoners listened in silence, some tilting their heads, straining to catch words they half understood. Then, to their astonishment, the song shifted. The choir began anew, this time in halting but careful German. "O du fröhliche, o du selige, gnadenbringende Weihnachtszeit." The prisoners gasped. Some pressed hands to their mouths. Others broke instantly, shoulders shaking with sobs. They had not heard that carol since before the war, when their children's voices had filled living rooms glowing with candlelight. Now, across an ocean, in the land of their enemy, the sound returned. Marta buried her face in her hands. "It feels like home," she whispered, her voice muffled by tears. Like before. Beside her, Elsa stared upward, her eyes wet but wide. Why would they do this for us? She asked hoarsely. No one had an answer. The congregation sang on, their German imperfect, their accents thick, but the prisoners heard only kindness, the notes wrapped around them like a forgotten embrace. For a moment, Anna drifted into memory. She was a girl again, sitting by the fire in her parents' farmhouse, the scent of pine and bread filling the air. Her father's voice joined in song, her mother lighting a candle. She remembered laughter, warmth, the glow of Christmas before the world collapsed. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she whispered, "Mama." When she opened her eyes, she was back in the church, surrounded by guards, prisoners, and strangers. Yet the song had bridged the distance. For one fleeting instant, war did not exist. At the end of the hymn, the minister gestured to baskets placed near the altar. A few townspeople stepped forward, carrying them down the aisles. Inside were small gifts, apples, nuts, simple sweets wrapped in paper. The prisoners froze as baskets reached their pews. "Take one," the guard murmured. Anna's hand trembled as she reached for a red apple. Its skin glistened in the candlelight, smooth and firm. She held it gently, as though it might vanish. She had not seen such a fruit in years. Marta clutched a small packet of nuts, staring at it as though it were treasure. Elsa picked up a piece of hard candy, her lips trembling as she whispered, "For my son, he has never tasted this." Tears spilled freely. The women held their gifts with reverence, humbled and broken. They had been prepared for scorn, but mercy was far harder to endure. The townsfolk watched quietly. Some smiled faintly, others wiped their own eyes. They had lost sons and husbands to the war, yet here they were, extending compassion to those who had been their enemies. The prisoners could not understand it. Mercy, offered so freely, cut deeper than any punishment could have. After the baskets were passed, candles were lit one by one. A small girl, no older than 8, carried a taper down the aisle, handing flames to each pew. When she reached the row of prisoners, she hesitated only a moment before offering her candle. Anna stared at the flame, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, trembling, she touched her wick to the child's. Her candle flickered to life. Around her, other prisoners did the same. Soon the row glowed with small lights, their faces bathed in warm radiance. Marta whispered, "I thought I would never hold a candle at Christmas again." Her voice broke. "Not after the ruins." Elsa clutched hers tightly, whispering, "It feels like heaven returned." The carol resumed. Silent night, holy night. The prisoners joined in, their voices thin at first, then stronger. Some sang in German, others faltered along with the English, but together their voices blended, rising toward the rafters. For the first time since their capture, they did not feel like prisoners. They felt like women again, daughters, mothers, children of God. Outside, snow fell softly. Inside, the church glowed with light and song. The guards shifted uneasily, moved despite themselves. One later scribbled in his notebook, "The Kraut women cried like children tonight, not from fear, from carols. They said they never thought they'd see Christmas again. I never thought I'd pity an enemy, but I did." The service continued, hymns weaving with prayers, candles glowing in trembling hands. The women wept openly now, no longer hiding their tears. Their shoulders shook, their voices cracked, but they sang. And as the final notes faded into silence, they sat in stunned quiet, clutching their apples, their nuts, their candies, their candles. Mercy had undone them. As the congregation bowed for prayer, Anna whispered to Marta, "I cannot hate them any more. Not tonight." Marta shook her head, tears dripping onto her lap. "Nor I, but it hurts more than hatred ever did." The minister's voice rose. Tonight we remember that light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The women bowed their heads. For them, the words were not just scripture. They were truth. The final hymn drifted into silence, candles glowing like stars across the pews. For a long moment, no one moved. The German women sat motionless, clutching their lights, their small gifts, their breath trembling in the quiet. Then the minister raised his hand. "Peace to you all," he said simply. The congregation murmured amen. Slowly the prisoners extinguished their candles, smoke curling upward, the scent of wax and pine lingering. The guards signaled it was time to leave. Reluctantly, the women rose. They shuffled into the aisle, their boots clicking softly against the stone floor. As they passed the altar, many hesitated, glancing once more at the garlands, the glowing tree, the wreath of holly hung proudly on the wall. For some, it was the first Christmas tree they had seen since before the war. Outside, snow had thickened, blanketing the street in quiet white. The townsfolk filed out behind them, lanterns in hand. A few children waved shyly at the prisoners, their faces open and unafraid. One little girl, the same who had lit Anna's candle, whispered, "Merry Christmas," in halting German. Anna's chest tightened. She whispered back, "Danke," tears spilling onto her cheeks. The march back to camp was silent except for the crunch of snow. Guards kept their distance, rifles slung, no words spoken. The prisoners walked with heads bowed, but not in shame, in awe, in sorrow, in something they could not name. That night in the barracks, no one slept easily. The women lay awake on their bunks, staring into the dark, replaying every detail. The carols sung in German, the apple in their hands, the candle's warmth, the child's smile. Whispers threaded through the silence. Elsa murmured, "I felt human again." Marta answered, voice ragged, "It hurt more than chains, because it reminded me what we lost." Gerda said softly, "My church is rubble, but tonight I saw one still standing, filled with song, and I wept because I realized Germany will not hear bells again for years." Anna pressed the apple to her chest. "I will never eat this. I will keep it, even if it rots, because it proves there is mercy still in the world." In the days that followed, the women returned again and again to that night. They spoke of it in whispers at dawn, in murmurs during chores, in confessions before sleep. Some clung to pride, insisting the service had been staged for pity. But most admitted the truth. It had been genuine. And that truth broke them far more deeply than cruelty ever could. A soldier's diary entry captured it. "I thought bringing them to church was a mistake. I figured they'd mock it or refuse. Instead, they cried through the whole thing. One said afterward she thought she'd never hear Christmas again. I didn't know what to do. Never figured mercy could wound deeper than hate." Weeks later, when letters finally reached the camp through the Red Cross, one woman wrote to her sister, "We were taken to a church on Christmas Eve. The enemy sang to us in our own tongue. I wept as I have not since childhood. It shames me to admit it, but I felt God more clearly there than in the ruins of home. Perhaps he was waiting for us across the ocean all along." Another wrote, "Tell the children I held a candle at Christmas. Tell them I sang Stille Nacht. Tell them I remembered them." The Ensors allowed the letters through. Families back in Germany wept as they read them, stunned that such a thing could happen in captivity. The memory of that night never left the women. Decades later, when interviewed as old women with grey hair and trembling hands, they did not speak first of hunger or barbed wire. They spoke of the church. One survivor whispered, "I had lost my faith in God after the bombs. But when I heard Americans sing O du Fröhliche in broken German, I felt it return. For one night, enemies were brothers." Another said, "It was harder than hate. I could have endured cruelty. But mercy? Mercy made me see how wrong we had been. That night, I knew we had lost not only the war, but our souls to lies. For the Americans, too, the night left its mark. Soldiers wrote home about the women's tears, about how enemies knelt under the same roof. A chaplain later recalled, "They wept not because they were prisoners, but because they were reminded they were still human." In that, the service was the greatest victory. As the war faded into history, that Christmas Eve lingered as a quiet story of shock and mercy. German women POWs marched into an American church expecting humiliation, instead found carols, candles, and kindness. They were stunned, undone, transformed. And though the world outside was scarred by war, for one night in 1945, the walls of enmity cracked beneath the sound of hymns. A prisoner wrote in her journal, "I thought chains would break me, but no, it was mercy. On Christmas Eve they gave us back our humanity, and I could not stop the tears."